The choice laid before Wyatt Coleman was the kind that could forge a dynasty or dig a grave. It wasn't a choice between two women, not really. It was a choice between two futures, both shimmering under the relentless Montana sun. One was a gilded cage offered by Penelope Harrington, an heiress whose beauty was the talk of the territory, a beauty as sharp and flawless as a cut diamond. Her hand promised land power and the end of a lifetime of struggle. The other future was a flickering candle in the darkest corner of the Dust Devil Saloon, held by a girl most men never saw twice. Maeve, they called her. Just Maeve. A forgotten wisp of a woman who served whiskey with downcast eyes, offering nothing but the quiet dignity of a shared silence. In the hard calculus of the West, the choice was simple. It was obvious, and that is precisely why the story of how Wyatt Coleman chose is one worth telling. Wyatt Coleman was a man carved from the very rock and dust of the West, but his soul was forged in the fire and thunder of the East. The war between the states had taken his youth, his brothers, and his tolerance for the clamor of so-called civilization. He'd come to the Montana Territory with nothing but a government land grant for a patch of stubborn soil, 2 strong hands, and a silence that clung to him like a second skin. His 3 years in Redemption Gulch had been a relentless battle against drought rustlers and the ghosts that visited him in the dead of night. His small ranch, the Triple Creek, was more a testament to his grit than a profitable enterprise. It was a life of bare-knuckle survival, and he was losing. That's why he was sitting in the opulent, overstuffed office of Bartholomew Harrington. The room was an affront to the landscape outside. Mahogany desk leather-bound books that had never been opened, and a decanter of brandy that cost more than Wyatt's best horse. Harrington was the town. He owned the bank, the freight company, and the mortgage on nearly every business on Main Street. He was a man of soft hands and a gaze as hard as iron ore. Coleman Harrington began his voice a low rumble of authority. He didn't offer a drink. "You're a hard worker. I respect that. You've held on to that parcel longer than the 5 men before you combined. But respect doesn't pay the bills, does it?" Wyatt didn't flinch. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the man behind the desk. "Your note at the bank is coming due," Harrington continued, steepling his fingers. "And frankly, your collateral, a 12 head of scrawny cattle and a half-built cabin, is an insult to my ledger." "I'll have the money," Wyatt said, his voice raspy from disuse. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The blight had taken half his herd 2 months prior. Harrington smiled a predator's curl of the lips. "I have no doubt you'll try. But I am here to offer you more than a simple extension. I am offering you a partnership, an empire." It was then that the door opened and Penelope Harrington entered. If Redemption Gulch was a dusty diorama of greys and browns, Penelope was a splash of impossible color. Dressed in a gown of emerald green silk, shipped all the way from a dressmaker in St. Louis, her auburn hair was piled in an immaculate coiffure. Her face was a perfect porcelain mask of high society beauty, her blue eyes assessing Wyatt with a cool, proprietary air. She was the prize, the jewel of the territory, and the subject of every bachelor's clumsy ambitions. "Wyatt," she said, her voice like honeyed whiskey. She extended a gloved hand, not for him to shake, but for him to bow over a custom so foreign in this land of calloused handshakes that it felt like a test. He gave a stiff nod instead. "My daughter, as you know, is of marriageable age," Harrington stated bluntly. "She requires a husband, a man of fortitude and good stock, not some simpering clerk from back east. She needs a man who can tame this land. And I need a successor, an heir to my legacy, who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty. You, Coleman, fit the bill." The proposition hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Marry Penelope. In return, The Triple Creek Ranch would be expanded, its debts erased. Wyatt would become the heir to the Harrington fortune, the second most powerful man in the territory. It was a king's ransom. "Penelope has taken a liking to you," Harrington added, though Penelope's expression was as unreadable as a frozen river. "She finds your rustic stoicism charming." Wyatt looked at her. He saw the perfection, the flawless skin, the expensive fabric. But he also saw a profound emptiness in her eyes, a calculated chill that the war had taught him to recognize. It was the look of a general moving pieces on a map, not of a woman considering a life partner. This wasn't an offer of love. It was a merger. He was an asset to be acquired. He thought of his parched land, the ache in his back, the gnawing hunger that was a constant companion. This was his escape. This was the end of the fight. "I'll need to think on it," Wyatt said, his voice low and steady. Harrington's smile tightened. "Don't think too long, Coleman. Opportunity in this country is a fast horse, and it doesn't wait for indecisive men." Wyatt walked out of the Harrington manor and on to the dusty street, the weight of the offer pressing down on him. He felt like he'd been offered the world, but all he could feel was the bars of a cage closing around him. He walked without thinking, his boots kicking up clouds of ochre dust, until he found himself pushing through the swinging doors of the one place where a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account, the Dust Devil Saloon. The place smelled of stale beer, sweat, and desperation, and it was there in the dim, smoky light that his eyes first truly fell upon the forgotten saloon girl. The Dust Devil Saloon was a symphony of chaos. The tinny, out-of-tune notes of the upright piano fought with the raucous laughter of prospectors, the sharp clap of poker cards on a table, and the low murmur of deals being made in shadowed corners. Wyatt took a seat at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey, letting the noise wash over him. It was a familiar chaos that for once failed to drown out the turmoil in his own head. He saw her then. He'd seen her 100 times before, of course, but he'd never looked. Her name was Maeve O'Connell, though few patrons bothered to learn it. She moved through the saloon like a ghost, her faded calico dress a stark contrast to the garish satin and feathers of the other girls. She was plain by the standards of the West. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple, severe bun, and her face was pale unpainted, and often framed by a curtain of weary anonymity. She refilled glasses, cleared away empty bottles, and wiped down tables with an efficiency that rendered her invisible. She never engaged in the flirtatious banter, never offered a practiced smile. Her currency was silence and service. Tonight, something was different. Perhaps it was the Harringtons' suffocating offer that had sharpened Wyatt's senses to anything genuine. He watched her as a drunken cowboy, a burly man named Finn, grabbed her wrist as she passed. "Hey now, sweet thing." Finn slurred his face, flushed with cheap liquor. "How's about a smile for old Finn? You look like you just buried your dog." Wyatt's hand instinctively tightened around his glass. He was about to stand when he saw Maeve's reaction. She didn't panic or cry out. She simply stopped and looked at Finn's hand on her arm, her expression not one of fear, but of profound, bone-deep tiredness. "Please let go of my arm, Mr. Finn," she said, her voice surprisingly clear and low, devoid of any tremble. It was a voice that didn't belong to the din of the saloon. It was quiet, but it carried. Finn laughed, and if I don't, she didn't answer. She just waited, her gaze steady. It was the damnedest thing Wyatt had ever seen. She didn't plead or threaten. She simply presented him with her stillness, a small island of calm in his drunken storm. After a long moment, confused and unnerved, Finn grumbled and released her. She nodded once, a gesture of finality, and continued on her way. Later that night, the crowd began to thin. The piano player, a portly man named Gus, finally gave up and retired to a back room. The saloon fell into a relative quiet, broken only by the snores of a passed-out prospector. Wyatt was about to leave when he heard it. A melody, soft tentative notes began to drift from the old upright piano. It wasn't the boisterous, clumsy music Gus played. This was different. It was a piece full of aching melancholy and a strange, complex beauty. Wyatt turned. It was Maeve. She was seated at the piano, her back to the room. Her fingers, which he'd only ever seen gripping bottles and rags, moved across the yellowed keys with a grace and certainty that was mesmerizing. She was playing for herself, lost in a world far removed from Redemption Gulch. The music spoke of rain-slicked city streets of libraries, filled with silent knowledge of a life of softness and thought that was utterly alien to this harsh land. It was a lament, a memory of a world she had lost. Wyatt sat in the shadows, transfixed. He was a man who understood loss. He understood the language of unspoken grief, and in that music he heard a story far more compelling than the one Penelope Harrington's perfect face tried to tell. He heard the quiet composition of a soul that had endured, not by being loud or beautiful, but by holding on to a small, secret piece of itself in the dark. When she finished, the final note hung in the dusty air like a prayer. She didn't seem to notice him. She simply lowered her hands, closed the keyboard cover with a soft click, and stood up to collect the last few dirty glasses. The ghost was back. But Wyatt Coleman had seen her. For the first time, he had truly seen the forgotten girl, and the sight had planted a seed of doubt in the barren soil of his soul so deep it threatened to undo the entire Harrington empire. The following week was a study in contrasts. By day, Wyatt was drawn into the Harringtons' orbit. Penelope insisted on showing him his future. They rode out in a polished carriage to the vast tracts of land that bordered his own small ranch. From this ridge all the way to the mountains father will acquire it, she declared, her arm sweeping across the horizon. It will be the largest cattle operation in the territory. The Harrington Coleman Ranch. She spoke of trips to San Francisco, of ordering furniture from New York, of hosting a governor's ball. Her words painted a picture of a life of immense wealth and influence, yet she never once asked him about his life, his dreams for the land, or the names of the horses he'd raised from foals. He was a component in her grand design, the sturdy, rustic foundation upon which she would build her social palace. The cracks in her perfect porcelain facade began to show in small, telling ways. During a dinner at their mansion, a young serving girl, no older than 16, accidentally spilled a drop of gravy on the pristine white tablecloth near Penelope's plate. Wyatt saw the flash of fury in Penelope's eyes, a look of such venomous contempt it made his blood run cold. She didn't say a word, but her chilling silence and the subtle tightening of her lips were more damning than any shout. The girl trembled, whispered a frantic apology, and practically fled the room. Bartholomew Harrington watched the exchange with a look of detached approval, as if his daughter had passed some silent test of aristocratic cruelty. Later, while discussing a new breed of bull, Wyatt mentioned a technique he'd learned from a Mexican vaquero about herd management. Penelope laughed a short, brittle sound. "Wyatt, darling, you won't be needing to listen to the advice of itinerant farmhands anymore. Father will hire the best foreman from Chicago. You'll be managing the ledgers, not the livestock." The dismissal was absolute. His experience, his hard-won knowledge of the land, was worthless to her. It was the grit under her fingernails to be washed away as soon as possible. Each evening, Wyatt found himself drawn back to the Dust Devil Saloon. He wasn't there for the whiskey anymore. He was there for the silence that followed the chaos. He'd wait until closing time until Maeve believed she was alone, and the music would begin. He never approached her, never spoke. He just sat in his corner and listened. He learned her moods through her music. Some nights it was fiery and defiant, full of complex chords that sounded like an argument. Other nights it was achingly sad, a simple heart-breaking melody that spoke of unbearable loneliness. One night he stayed later than usual. As she finished playing, she let out a soft sigh and rested her forehead against the piano. She looked utterly defeated. Without thinking, Wyatt stood and walked over. She flinched when his shadow fell over her, her hands flying from the keys as if caught in a crime. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Wyatt said, his voice quiet. Her eyes were wide with a kind of cornered animal fear. I was just cleaning up. Your music," he said, gesturing to the piano. "It's beautiful. Where did you learn to play like that?" She looked down at her hands, red and chapped from lye soap and harsh work. They seemed incongruous with the divine sounds they had just produced. A long time ago, in another life. Her voice was low and educated, the vowels rounded and precise, so different from the clipped-hard speech of the West. My mother played Wyatt, offered sharing a piece of himself he hadn't spoken of in years. Not like you. Simple hymns. But she said it was the only way to make a room feel like a home. A flicker of something, not a smile, but a softening, touched Maeve's features. She was right. It's a way to remember. Remember what he asked gently. She hesitated, her gaze dropping back to the keys. That the world is larger than this town, that there are things other than dust and whiskey and survival. In that moment, Wyatt understood the chasm between the two women. Penelope wanted to conquer the world, to own it, to bend it to her will. Maeve simply wanted to remember that a world of beauty and grace still existed, even if she could only visit it through the memory of her fingertips on a set of worn-out ivory keys. One offered him an empire of things. The other offered a quiet acre of understanding for his soul. He started talking to her more, just for a few minutes each night. He learned she liked to read. The books were a scarcity she treasured. He found a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets left behind by a traveller and gave it to her. The look of stunned, grateful joy on her face when he handed it to her was more radiant than any of Penelope's calculated smiles. Penelope, meanwhile, was growing impatient. "The whole town is talking, Wyatt," she told him one afternoon, her voice sharp. "They're expecting an announcement. Father does not like to be kept waiting." The two worlds were colliding. The gilded cage was shrinking its door, swinging shut, and the flickering candle in the saloon, which he had once thought was a sign of fragility, was starting to feel like the only true and steady light in his entire world. The day of decision arrived like a thunderhead on the horizon, dark and inevitable. Bartholomew Harrington had summoned Wyatt to his manor for dinner. It wasn't a request. The unstated purpose of the evening was clear. Wyatt was to accept the proposal, and the engagement of Penelope Harrington to Wyatt Coleman would be announced at the Sunday service. The town would celebrate the Harrington dynasty would be secured, and Wyatt's life of struggle would be over. He spent the afternoon at his ranch, walking the fence line, the dry grass crunching under his boots. He looked at his small, sturdy cabin, built with his own hands. He looked at the Triple Creek, now just a trickle in the late summer heat, and the small herd of cattle that was the sum of his worldly wealth. It wasn't much, but it was his. Every splinter, every stone, every patch of dust was a piece of his own fight. Marrying Penelope meant giving it all up, not in ownership, but in spirit. He would become a glorified foreman on his own life's work. That evening he dressed in his only clean shirt, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar. He rode to the Harrington mansion, the grand building lit up like a beacon of prosperity against the darkening landscape. Dinner was a tense, formal affair. A lavish spread of roasted beef potatoes and imported vegetables covered the table. Penelope was dazzling in a gown of deep blue velvet, her conversation sparkling with anecdotes about influential families in Cheyenne and Denver. Bartholomew Harrington steered the conversation like a ship's captain, speaking of land acquisitions, railroad expansion, and the political levers he could pull. They spoke of the future, their future, as if it were a foregone conclusion. Wyatt remained largely silent, eating little, the food tasteless in his mouth. He felt like a ghost at the feast, his true self absent from the room. He kept picturing Maeve's hands on the piano keys, the quiet dignity in her eyes, as she faced down a drunken lout, the simple, soul-deep gratitude she'd shown for a tattered book of poems. He was choosing between a symphony played for a roaring crowd and a single perfect note played in the stillness of a lonely room. Finally, after the plates were cleared and brandy was poured, Harrington leaned back in his chair. "Well, Coleman, we've given you ample time to consider my generous proposition. The town is eager for good news. It is time to make things official." Penelope turned to him, her smile perfectly in place, but her eyes held a glint of steel. This was her moment of triumph, the acquisition of her final, most important asset. Wyatt took a slow breath, the silence in the room stretching thin. He looked at Bartholomew, then at his daughter. "Mr. Harrington." "Miss Harrington," he began, his voice level and clear. "I am honored by your offer. It is more than a man like me could ever expect." He paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. "But I cannot accept." The silence that followed was no longer just a pause. It was a physical thing, a sudden, shocking vacuum that sucked all the warmth from the room. Penelope's smile didn't fall. It froze, cracking like a pane of ice. Bartholomew Harrington's affable mask dissolved, revealing the cold granite face of a tyrant, denied his prize. "What? Did you say?" Harrington's voice was dangerously soft. "I am grateful for the offer," Wyatt repeated, standing up from the table. "But I must decline. I cannot marry your daughter." Penelope's composure finally shattered. A flush of furious red crept up her neck. "Decline. You are declining me. A penniless, dirt-scrabbling rancher dares to refuse a Harrington." Her voice was a hiss of disbelief and wounded pride. "This is not about money or what you are," Wyatt said, his gaze steady on her. "This is about who I am, and I am not the man for this life. Or for you." Bartholomew slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, the brandy glasses jumping. "You fool. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? This is not an offer you can simply refuse. This is the future. It's your future, Mr. Harrington." "Not mine," Wyatt said, turning to leave. "You will regret this." Coleman Harrington snarled, his face contorted with rage. "I built this town from nothing. I can unmake a man just as easily. You think you've been fighting to survive? You haven't even begun to fight. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging for the scraps from my table. You'll own nothing. You'll be nothing." Wyatt didn't look back. He walked out of the opulent dining room through the grand foyer and out into the cool night air. The threats echoed behind him, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. He had rejected a fortune, an empire, and the most beautiful woman in the territory. He had chosen his own ruin. He rode not for his ranch, but for the dim lights of the Dust Devil Saloon. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't face it alone. He needed to hear the music. He needed to see the forgotten girl who had, without trying, reminded him of what was real. He had chosen the flickering candle over the chandelier. and now the storm was about to break. Bartholomew Harrington was not a man who made idle threats. His wrath, when unleashed, was not a fiery public explosion, but a cold, systematic strangulation. The retribution began the very next morning. Wyatt rode into town to buy feed, and was met with a changed world. At the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, a man with whom Wyatt had always been on good terms, suddenly couldn't meet his eye. "Sorry, Wyatt," Henderson mumbled, wringing his hands. "Got a new policy from my supplier. Cash only. No credit." Since when, Wyatt asked, knowing the answer. Since this morning. It was the same everywhere. The blacksmith discovered a sudden month-long backlog and couldn't shoe his horses. The livery wouldn't sell him oats. A notice was posted on the bank door, announcing that the note on the Triple Creek Ranch previously due in 2 months had been reviewed and was now callable in full within 1 week. The reason cited was instability of collateral. It was signed by the bank president, Bartholomew Harrington. The whispers followed him down the street. Men who had clapped him on the back a week ago now averted their gaze. Women hurried their children along as he passed. He wasn't just a man in debt. He was a pariah. A living example of what happened when you defied the town's king. Penelope, in a stroke of vindictive genius, had spread her own version of the story that Wyatt had made a vulgar and insulting advance upon her, and her father had righteously cast him out. In a town that revered the Harrington name, the lie was easier to believe than the truth. The pressure mounted. One evening, as he rode back to his ranch, 2 men stepped out from behind a rock formation, blocking the trail. Wyatt recognized them as hired hands from one of Harrington's larger outfits. Their leader was a hulking brute with a scarred face named Corbin Nash. Evening Coleman Nash grunted a length of heavy rope coiled in his hand. "Heard you were having some trouble. Mr. Harrington is a generous man. He'd be willing to forgive your debt. All you have to do is sign over the deed to your ranch and get on the next stagecoach, heading east. I'm not for sale, Nash." Wyatt said, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. Nash chuckled a low, menacing sound. "Everything's for sale out here. Your land, your pride, even your life." The 2 men lunged. Wyatt was ready. He kicked his horse forward, crashing into one of them, and swung a fist that caught Nash square in the jaw. The fight was brutal and quick. They were thugs, not gunmen, and Wyatt was a veteran who had survived Antietam. He left them both groaning in the dust. But he rode away with a split lip, bruised ribs, and the cold knowledge that this was only the beginning. Harrington wouldn't stop with financial ruin. He would resort to violence to get what he wanted. Wyatt was being besieged from all sides, isolated and broken down. He spent his days trying to find a buyer for his cattle in the next county over a desperate, time-consuming ride. And his nights were sleepless, listening for the sound of hoofbeats in the dark. He stopped going to the saloon. He couldn't risk bringing his trouble to Maeve's doorstep. He couldn't bear the thought of Harrington's cold eyes falling upon her. But his absence didn't go unnoticed. One evening there was a soft knock on his cabin door. He opened it, pistol in hand, to find Maeve standing on his porch, a small lantern in one hand and a covered basket in the other. I heard what happened," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "The whole town is talking. I brought you some food. I figured you hadn't been to town." Wyatt was stunned. No one had dared to associate with him for days. Yet here she was, the forgotten saloon girl, the one person with the most to lose, standing on his porch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You shouldn't be here, Maeve," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you're seen, what are they going to do?" "Fire me." A sad, wry smile touched her lips. There are 100 saloons, just like the dust devil. But there's only one man in this town who gave me a book of poetry instead of a lewd comment. Please let me in. The wind is cold." He stepped aside and let her in. She placed the basket on his rough-hewn table, uncovering bread, cheese, and a piece of cooked chicken. It was a feast. As they sat in the quiet of his cabin, the lamplight casting warm shadows on the walls, Wyatt felt the crushing weight on his shoulders lift just for a moment. "Why did you do it, Wyatt?" she asked softly, her gaze direct and searching. "Why did you say no? Everyone knows what they offered you." He looked at her plain, honest face, illuminated by the flickering light. "Because I would have had to become a man I didn't recognize," he said simply. "And because I've seen enough of men who believe they have the right to own everything and everyone." Maeve's eyes held his, and in their depths he saw not pity, but a profound and sorrowful understanding. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his, her touch surprisingly warm and steady. "You know, Mr. Harrington is not the first man of his kind that I have met," she said, her voice taking on a new, harder edge. "Men who build their empires on the ruins of others. My father learned that lesson the hard way. And then, in the quiet solitude of the besieged cabin, the forgotten saloon girl began to tell him her story. It was a story that would not only explain the music she played, but would also transform Wyatt's desperate fight for survival into a quest for justice. The king's wrath had been terrible, but he had unknowingly driven his two greatest victims into an alliance that would threaten to bring his entire kingdom crashing down. The name Maeve O'Connell, as it turned out, was real. The life she'd hinted at was not a dream, but a stolen reality. She was not born to serve whiskey in a dusty saloon. She was the daughter of Professor Liam O'Connell, a respected, if somewhat eccentric academic from Philadelphia. My father wasn't a businessman. Maeve began her voice low and steady as she recounted the tale. He was a geologist and an historian. He believed the earth kept a record of its past, just like books. He was obsessed with the mineral wealth of the West, not for profit, but for knowledge. He spent years compiling research, creating maps and documenting ore deposits based on geological surveys and old Spanish records. Her father, she explained, had been a brilliant but trusting man. He secured investors for a modest mining survey company, intending to use scientific methods to locate mineral veins, a practice far more advanced than the haphazard prospecting common at the time. His primary investor, a charismatic and seemingly respectable financier from New York, was a man named B.H. Carter. Carter was charming. Maeve recalled a shadow passing over her face. He praised my father's genius. He talked of building libraries and funding universities with the profits. My father gave him everything: his maps, his research, his trust. Wyatt listened, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had a sickening premonition of where the story was heading. The company was a massive success, but the profits never came back to the other investors or to my father. Carter used my father's research to identify the richest claims, then used a series of shell corporations and legal maneuvers to systematically buy up the land and the rights for himself, cutting my father out completely. He created false reports, claimed the ventures were failures, and drove the original company into bankruptcy. He bled it dry. The other investors, ruined and betrayed, blamed Liam O'Connell. They called him a fool and a fraud. His reputation was shattered, drowning in debt and public disgrace, with legal notices piling up at his door. Professor O'Connell took his own life. "We lost everything," Maeve said, her eyes glistening but her voice unwavering. The house, the books, his name. I was 16. We were left with nothing. I had to run. I came west, changing my name, taking any work I could find, just trying to disappear. I ended up in Redemption Gulch, because it seemed like the last place on earth anyone would look for the daughter of a disgraced Philadelphia scholar. She paused, taking a deep breath. For years I've watched him. I recognized him the day I arrived in this town. He's older, heavier, but you don't forget the face of the man who destroyed your family. Who Wyatt asked, his voice a low growl, though he already knew the answer. B.H. Carter Maeve, said her eyes, locking onto his. Bartholomew Harrington. He took our fortune, took my father's life, and used it all to build this town, this empire. He buried his old name just like he buried my father. The revelation hit Wyatt like a physical blow. This wasn't just a petty feud over a rejected marriage proposal. The foundation of Harrington's entire kingdom, the bank, the land, the power, was built upon the theft and death that had cast Maeve into the shadows. Wyatt's small ranch, the Triple Creek, was a piece of the very land Harrington had likely swindled, using her father's research. His fight was now her fight. Her past was now his present. How can you prove any of this? Wyatt asked, his mind racing. Maeve reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped package. She carefully unwrapped it on the table. Inside was a small, worn leather ledger. My father was meticulous, she whispered, her fingers tracing the faded script on the cover. He was a scholar before he was a businessman. He kept copies of everything. His correspondence with Carter, the original geological surveys, his private notes, detailing every meeting, every promise made. He even noted his suspicions in the final weeks. It's all here. His own account of the swindle written in his own hand. Wyatt stared at the book. It wasn't just a ledger. It was a ghost. It was the truth, bound in worn leather. Harrington's wrath had been meant to crush him, to erase him from Redemption Gulch. Instead, it had unearthed a secret that could destroy the king himself. He thinks I'm just a forgotten girl who serves him whiskey. Maeve said, a fire Wyatt had never seen before, igniting in her eyes. He walks into the saloon and doesn't even see the daughter of the man he murdered, standing 3 feet away from him. He thinks he's untouchable. Wyatt looked from the ledger to Maeve's determined face. His own troubles, the foreclosed loan. The town's scorn. The hired thugs seemed small in comparison to the scale of this injustice. He had rejected Penelope's offer because it felt like a cage. Now he saw that the bars of that cage were forged from a crime that had haunted this quiet, forgotten woman for years. He's not untouchable, Wyatt said, his voice ringing with a newfound purpose. Not anymore. The flickering lamplight in Wyatt's cabin cast long dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel like a command tent on the eve of a momentous battle. Between them on the rough-hewn table lay the scholar's ledger. It was a humble-looking object, its leather cover worn smooth with time, but it felt as potent as a keg of black powder. For hours they had talked, piecing together the past and the present, until the full ugly tapestry of Bartholomew Harrington's life was laid bare. Wyatt and Maeve understood the futility of a direct assault. Harrington was a fortress, his walls built of money, influence, and the fear he inspired. To attack with force would be suicide. Their only weapon was the truth contained within the pages of that ledger, a truth so powerful they believed it could dismantle the fortress from the inside out, stone by stone. Their plan was audacious, relying not on guns or fists, but on the dormant conscience of Redemption Gulch. There are 2 men who might listen, Wyatt said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. Alistair Abernathy at the Chronicle. He's a cynic, but he despises Harrington. And Sheriff Brodie, he's a good man walking a tightrope. They will be risking everything, Maeve whispered, her gaze fixed on the ledger that held her father's ghost, their livelihoods. Maybe more. So are we. Wyatt replied, his hand covering hers on the table. Her skin was cool, but her grip was firm, resolute. But we're doing it together. Their first stop under the pale light of the new morning was the cluttered office of the Redemption Chronicle. The air inside was thick with the smells of lead ink and stale pipe smoke. Alistair Abernathy, a man whose shoulders seemed permanently stooped from the weight of other people's stories, was hunched over a typesetting tray, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as they entered, his expression souring slightly. "Coleman, I hear you've made yourself the most unpopular man in the territory. What do you want?" Wyatt gestured for Maeve to step forward. She placed the oilskin-wrapped ledger on Abernathy's desk, pushing aside a stack of old papers. "Mr. Abernathy," she began, her voice quiet, but imbued with a strength that made the editor pause. "I have a story for you. The real founding story of Redemption Gulch." Abernathy grunted, wiping his inky hands on a rag. "I've heard it. Harrington, the visionary, carved civilization from the wilderness. A regular Moses. The man who calls himself Harrington was a thief named B.H. Carter Maeve stated her words, dropping into the silence, like stones into a still pond, and he built his vision on the grave of my father. For the next hour Maeve spoke. She unspooled the entire sordid tale of her father, Liam O'Connell, his genius, his trust, and his ultimate betrayal. Wyatt stood back, a silent guard, watching as the editor's cynical facade began to crack. Abernathy listened intently, his sharp eyes darting from Maeve's earnest face to the ledger on his desk. When she finished, he picked it up, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened it, his finger tracing the elegant scholarly script. He read entries aloud in a low mutter, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock, and finally to a cold, simmering rage. He looked up, his gaze locking on Maeve. This is all true. His own handwriting, every word, she confirmed. Abernathy leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, the smoke from his forgotten pipe curling around his head. "I've always known Bartholomew Harrington was a predator." He rasped, his voice thick with a sudden fierce conviction. "A snake who charmed his way into owning the whole damned garden. I just never knew the name of his first kill." He leaned forward, tapping the ledger with a stained finger, his eyes gleaming. "This, Miss O'Connell, is not just a story. This is dynamite." Their second stop was Sheriff Brodie's office. Brodie was a man perpetually caught between the law he'd sworn to uphold and the powerful man who could unpin his badge with a single word. They found him oiling a shotgun, the methodical work of a man trying to keep his hands busy while his mind wrestled with itself. Wyatt laid out the situation, plainly without emotion. "Brodie, we're not asking you to pick a side. We're not asking you to arrest Harrington based on our word. Abernathy is printing the story. It's going to be public tomorrow morning. All we need is your guarantee that the law will be present on Main Street. You're asking for more than that," Wyatt Brodie said, not looking up from his work. "You're asking me to stand against the man who owns this town. Corbin Nash and his boys are on Harrington's payroll. Things could get ugly. That's why we came to you," Wyatt pressed. "Ugly is what happens when men like Nash think the law is looking the other way. We just want a fair hearing in the open. Let the town decide what's right." Brodie finally set the shotgun down and looked at them. His gaze was weary, etched with the compromises he'd had to make over the years. He looked at Wyatt, a man he respected now a pariah. Then his eyes settled on Maeve. She didn't plead or threaten. She simply stood there, her quiet dignity a more powerful argument than any words. She was the living consequence of a law that had failed once before. Brodie's gaze fell to the worn star on his own chest. He let out a long, slow breath. "The law applies to everyone. Coleman," he said at last, his voice firm, his decision made. "Rich or poor, I'll see that the peace is kept." The next morning, Redemption Gulch awoke to a revolution printed on cheap paper. A special edition of the Chronicle was on every corner. The headline was a thunderclap: "The Harrington Empire, built on a foundation of lies. Philadelphia scholar's daughter and stolen legacy come to light." The town began to buzz. People gathered in small, murmuring clumps, passing the paper from hand to hand. In the general store at the Saloon outside the church, the story was the same. The initial shock gave way to a feverish discussion. Years of unspoken resentments of deals that felt crooked, of foreclosures that seemed too swift, were now seen through a new, damning lens. Maeve's story gave a name and a face to the town's collective unease. Harrington's reaction was as swift and violent as a cornered rattlesnake. Just before noon he burst from the bank, his face a mask of purple rage. Flanked by Corbin Nash and 3 other hard-faced men, he stormed down the street toward the newspaper office, a monarch intent on crushing a peasant rebellion. But this time, the town wasn't cowering. They were watching. Wyatt and Maeve stood waiting on the boardwalk in front of the Chronicle, a silent 2-person front line. Abernathy stood in his doorway behind them. His arms crossed his expression, grim. "Lies slander Harrington," roared his voice, echoing across the now silent street. He pointed a trembling finger at Maeve, his eyes wild with fury. "This is the fantasy of a drunken saloon girl and a failed rancher. I will sue you into oblivion. Abernathy, I will own your press and melt it down for scrap. Everything in that paper is sourced." Bartholomew. Abernathy called back his voice, calm and steady, cutting through Harrington's tirade. "Perhaps you'd like to publicly refute the specific entries from Professor O'Connell's ledger. I have a press ready and waiting for your official response." The mention of the ledger of concrete evidence momentarily stunned Harrington into silence. Just then, Sheriff Brodie and his 2 deputies stepped into the middle of the street, positioning themselves between Harrington's posse and the newspaper office. "That's far enough, Mr. Harrington," Brodie said, his voice carrying a new weight of authority. "You can conduct your business, but these men of yours will keep their distance." Cornered, his physical intimidation thwarted, Harrington's composure began to crumble. He looked past the sheriff and saw the faces of the townspeople. For the first time, they were not looking at him with fear or reverence. They were looking at him with cold, hard judgment. Then a single voice broke the silence. It was Mr. Henderson, the store owner. "Is it true," he asked, his voice shaking but clear, "that you drove the Miller family off their farm last year with predatory loans?" Before Harrington could answer, another man shouted, "What about the assay reports from the Silver Creek mine? The ones that said the vein was tapped out right before your company bought the claim for pennies?" A woman near the back cried out, "You diverted the creek water for your own herds and left the rest of us with dust." The dam of fear had broken. Decades of quiet injustices and swallowed pride came pouring out in a torrent of accusations. Harrington, the untouchable king, was suddenly just a man, trapped and surrounded by the subjects he had systematically oppressed. His hired thugs looked around uneasily, their bluster useless against the collective anger of an entire community. In the midst of the chaos, Harrington's wild gaze finally landed on Maeve, and in that moment something shifted in his eyes. He wasn't just seeing the quiet saloon girl anymore. He was seeing the ghost of Liam O'Connell, The striking resemblance, the intelligent eyes, the unwavering spirit of the man he had destroyed. He was seeing the living embodiment of his original sin resurrected on Main Street for the whole world to witness. The recognition struck him with the force of a physical blow. He turned, sputtering his threats, dissolving into nonsensical blustering. He took a step back, then another, his retreat, a clumsy, panicked scramble. He fled toward the false security of his bank, his hired guns trailing behind him, like dogs whose master had just been whipped. The crowd didn't cheer. They simply watched in grim, silent judgment as he disappeared from view. Bartholomew Harrington had not been beaten by a gun, but by a story. His power had always relied on an illusion. In one morning, Maeve O'Connell's quiet truth, amplified by a brave editor and protected by a duty-bound sheriff, had shattered that illusion completely. The reckoning had come to Redemption Gulch, not with a bang, but with the rustle of newsprint and the steady voice of a forgotten girl who had finally been heard. The fall of the House of Harrington was not immediate, but it was absolute. The federal marshal, alerted by a wire from Sheriff Brody, arrived a week later from Helena. Armed with the ledger and testimonies from a dozen newly emboldened townspeople, he opened a full investigation into the financial dealings of B.H. Carter. Faced with federal fraud charges and the complete collapse of his credit and reputation, Bartholomew Harrington vanished one night, leaving his gaudy mansion and failing bank behind. Penelope, unable to bear the shame and the sudden poverty, took the first stagecoach east, never to be seen in the territory again. Redemption Gulch was a town reborn. The bank was reorganized under new local ownership. Mortgages were renegotiated. A spirit of cooperation, long suppressed under Harrington's reign, began to bloom. The town was no longer a fiefdom, but a community. On the Triple Creek Ranch, life changed as well. Wyatt Coleman, with a fair loan from the new bank and the help of his neighbors, was finally able to build his ranch into the thriving operation he had always envisioned. But it was no longer just his. Maeve O'Connell never served another whiskey. She sold her father's story, the original ledger, to a publisher back east, securing a small fortune that was rightfully hers. But she didn't leave. She had found her home, not in the grand parlors of Philadelphia, but in the simple, sturdy cabin Wyatt had built with his own hands. They were married by the circuit judge, that fall in a simple ceremony on the porch of the cabin, with Sheriff Brody and Alistair Abernathy as their witnesses. Maeve filled the small home with books, and after Wyatt surprised her by having the old saloon piano hauled up the dusty road with music, the melancholy tunes of her past were still there, but now they were mingled with new compositions, ones filled with hope and a quiet, powerful joy. Wyatt Coleman was never a rich man in the way the world measured wealth. He never commanded an empire of land or money. But as he sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky, listening to the sound of his wife playing the piano inside, he knew he was the wealthiest man he had ever met. He had been offered a gilded cage and the hand of a beautiful heiress. Instead, he had chosen a partnership with a forgotten saloon girl. He had chosen truth over power, character over coin, and in doing so, he hadn't just saved his ranch, he had redeemed the soul of a town, and more importantly, his own. The story of Wyatt Maeve and the fall of a tyrant isn't just a tale of the Old West, it's a timeless reminder that true value is rarely found in the glittering facades of wealth and power. It's often hidden in the quiet corners in the unassuming souls who carry their integrity like a secret treasure. Maeve O'Connell was deemed forgotten because the world chose not to see her, and Wyatt Coleman was deemed a fool for rejecting a fortune. But together, they proved that a single voice speaking the truth can be more powerful than an empire built on lies. Their legacy wasn't in a name carved on a bank, but in the freedom of a community and the quiet music that filled their home. If their story of quiet courage and unexpected love resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a story where the underdog wins, and subscribe for more tales from the dusty pages of history. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.